All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone today to our webinar. My name is Jennifer Ferris. I'm the Assistant Director of the Saratoga Springs Public Library in the Southern Adirondack region of New York. And I am a member of the advisory board for the Sustainable Libraries Initiative. And I was one of the co-creators for the Public Library Certification Program. I have the honor, and yes, it is an honor, to welcome Ron Kirsop back to present on project planning. And if you were unable to join Ron back in December, his strategic planning webinar is still available on our website. I'll put that in the chat after I'm done speaking with the little intro. Ron, if you can do the next slide, please. So just a few housekeeping items to discuss before we get started. Please make sure that you're on mute during this presentation. And if you're just joining in, we will be recording this webinar and should make it available on our website as soon as possible. Please use the chat for questions. And if you would like to remain anonymous, you can send a private chat to me. Next slide, please. And if you are not yet working towards a certification program with us and would like to know more about the program, please check out our website. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can connect with us, and it's an email form. Next slide. I am always happy to spend time listening to my friend Ron, especially when he talks about time management. Definitely need a little tip here or there. It gives me some more validation on things that I already have in my knowledge base, but it also gives me a lot of room to grow and think. And the next slide, please. So I know that you will also take away some helpful tips today so that you can work on any project that you wish you had the time to get to, including our certification program. And I will now hand it off to Ron. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jen. So we got a small group here today, but hopefully this recording will be able to help out the people who maybe weren't able to come in. So I'm Ron Kirsop. I'm the Executive Director of the OWL Library System. OWL has two W's. We know how to spell it. It just stands for Ontario, Wayne, Wyoming, Livingston County. So it's the 4 counties that we serve. I do work at the library system, so I get to oversee all kinds of different projects in different types of capacities. So today, what I'm going to talk about is project management in general. And these are things that you can apply to just about any project, regardless of its size, that you're doing locally. So if you want, while we're going through this, you can keep in mind maybe a project that you have coming up, maybe one that you're working on right now. As you're thinking about that and we go through the different processes, you may think that you need to backtrack a little bit on your project and adjust some things. That's totally fine. That's the way that projects oftentimes work. We think about it in a life cycle. So from birth to execution to finishing the project, we want to think about every step along the way. I did this presentation for the New York Library Association in 2022. So you'll see at the bottom here, there's a little bit.ly link. You're welcome to use that. I left all the resources, a couple different charter templates, maybe some timeline templates that you can pull out of there. So you're welcome to use that one if you would like. So as you can see on the first page here, after my name, I do have PMP, and what that is I am a certified project management professional, and this certification comes from the Project Management Institute. And with the Project Management Institute, they are able to certify project managers in a wide variety of specifications. Some of their project management certifications are a little bit less, and some of them are kind of much larger, kind of capstone type situations. I took the general Project Management Institute PMP certification. process, and what that was, people usually are curious about what that involves. And typically all you need to do is pass a 200 question multiple choice test in order to receive your PMP certificate. It's not an easy test, and there's quite a bit of studying that goes along with it. And when I took it, probably the key thing that I walked away from it is that whenever they asked a question and you had 5 multiple choice answers, all the answers were correct. You just had to pick the one that was the most correct. So it was tricky in that sense. You can get different project management degrees. You can go for different types of certification. But I noticed that the PMP certification is becoming more and more prevalent in a lot of industry. And I have noticed a few library individuals being able, that have brought it to the table recently too. As you go through courses or you read books and things like that, usually the projects that you are looking at are kind of larger scale, like technology projects or building projects, things like that. However, I think a lot of the stuff that we do in libraries fits in pretty well with the project management principles. Now, when you're learning about project management, there are a significant number of areas to learn about. There are the 12 knowledge areas, 5 process groups, and 49 processes. So it's a lot to digest. This diagram walks through each of the different areas and all the pieces that go in there. And you can't read this right now because it's really blurry, and that's fine because we're not getting into all of these things today. This would take weeks and weeks to talk about every step through initiating, planning, executing, etc. Today, what I want to focus on are mainly just those 5 groups: the planning, initiating, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing, and giving a general overview of how these process groups can be applied fairly easily to any project that you're working on. As I'm going through these different things, if you have questions or you think of things that pop up, definitely let me know. I'm happy to talk through any of these things that you want. I'm going to try to close out pretty close to the hour. I think we have 90 minutes for this one, but we'll see what we can do about getting us out of here on time. So the first thing that I want to talk about are the differences between projects and operations. So oftentimes when we're talking about project management, there's a little bit of confusion that happens between the two. And when you're applying project management principles, typically they're not going to fit very well with any type of operation that you have within your organization, because they are meant specifically for those types of projects. And when we talk about the difference between a project or an operation, it's pretty much a project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique project, service, or result. And what this means is just when you start up project, you're just looking to create something unique. It doesn't necessarily have to be unique to the world, just unique for your organization or unique for even the time frame. When we're talking about operations, these are the things that are ongoing, the activities that you're involved with all the time. For example, payroll, that's an operation. If payroll is an operation, you could have maybe your organization is changing to a new payroll provider. Maybe you're going from paychecks to another thing. That big changeover could be considered a project, but the things that you're doing on a regular basis that really don't have a start or end date, those are operations. So projects are one-time things that happen and then they close out. Operations are the things that happen all the time, they keep going. One point that I like to make here is some things may fall in one or the other category depending on how you structure them. A good example that I like to use for libraries is, so a lot of libraries have library programs, and they have library programs on kind of a regular basis. Maybe they have 2, 3, 4, 5 a month. And they have those every month throughout the year. So some may say that's an operation, but you can also use this project structure to plan those and make them a project as opposed to an operation by simply having it set up to where you apply the processes. So let's say you go through the project management process to get all of your programs scheduled for the next 6 months. Has a clear start date, a clear end date. You have your stakeholders, your budget, your schedule, everything in there in a project plan, and then you redo that every 6 months for your project plan schedule. That can then be considered a project, even though it's happening on a regular basis. That'll make a little bit more sense as we get into some of the process groups, but that's just one example that I like to give when we're talking the difference between projects and operations. So just keep in mind as we're talking today, project is work to create a unique outcome. When we're talking about project management, probably if you know anything about it, you may have heard a couple different terms. There's lots of different project management styles out there. Historically, the waterfall method has been one of the more popular project management processes or strategies, and agile is becoming more and more increasingly popular. I know probably more individuals that have some certification in agile project management than I do just the typical PMP, which is an overview of all project management styles and how they apply to project management. The waterfall method, the terminology basically means that you have this project idea, you do all the work, you design it, you have it, and then you test it, and you see what breaks, and then you fix that, and then you implement it. So from start to finish, you make sure you have everything that you want, you test it out to make sure it works, and then here you go, there's the final project. The reason that agile becomes a little bit more popular these days is because it has a lot more iterative steps where it goes through different sprints and it says, okay, we are going to design a little piece of this. We're going to test it and we're going to say, is this exactly what we're doing? Yes. So we have this piece that's ready to go and it's going to move into sprint 2. We're going to test it out to make sure that it works. And then to sprint 3, and eventually you're going to implement. But it's this communication cycle back and forth to make sure that everything that you're working on is tested against the features that you're supposed to have in there. It has a lot more communication. It's smaller work steps. So rather than doing all the design at once, you kind of pick out sections of it and you do it that way. So that's just an overview of when you hear different project management terms. There's different ones that'll pop up to Kanban, Six Sigma. There's quite a few different project management approaches. Today, we're not talking about a specific approach. We're just going into the entry level, making the processes as easy as possible to apply to your existing projects. Everything that you're going to work on, and I know that triple constraints, triple bottom line is a term that's oftentimes used in the sustainability initiative. This is just a little bit different triple constraints. These are the triple constraints for project management. And the 3 areas that will depend on successfully completing a project are your scope, your schedule, and your budget. If any of these 3 things are out of alignment, you're going to have a hard time finishing, closing out, or successfully navigating a project, mainly because you could have the best project design in the world, which is scope, all the time in the world to do it. But if you don't have any money to do the project, then you're not going to be able to effectively do it. And same thing with if you have all the money in the world and you have all the time in the world, but you don't know what the project actually is, you're probably not going to be very successful with it because you don't know what it is. So these 3 areas are what need to be in balance. You need to make sure that you scope out your project efficiently, you schedule it to the best of your ability, and you have the money to be able to complete it. So thinking about these 3 different areas are going to be pretty critical for any successful project in the long run. And I'll send out all of these slides to everybody, so don't feel like you have to draw this triangle and write those things down. You'll be able to have it because I'm happy to share these with you. So getting into the processing. So the first process when you're thinking through a project is the initiation phase. So this is before we do any planning, before we assign a project manager. This is essentially just thinking through what is it that we would like to do. The initiation phase has a few different things that we need to think about. And the first one is going to be developing a project charter. And a project charter is talking about, it's usually a formal, think about it as like a formal activation document. This is the key that you're going to plug into your project, turn it, and then your project's going to start. So this is everything that's starting out. And this is a short document, and all the documentation I'm going to talk about today, because project management has a lot of documentation that goes with it. None of these need to be like multi-page documents. Your project charter can be this length right here if you want it, just a simple paragraph. Mainly what you're trying to do is just describe your project. You want to know what the objectives are, so ultimately what you're trying to achieve, how it's going to be carried out, who the stakeholders are, and typically you're going to want to know who's going to be the point person or the person that's in charge with it. So this is going to be your project charter. You should think of it like a recipe. So when you're, I don't know if you guys, if you watch the Great British Baking Show. So when they get to the technical challenge, you know how they get the recipe, and it's just kind of a truncated version of a recipe where it may not have the specifics on each case, but it has like the overview of what it's supposed to turn out to be. That's kind of your project charter. Doesn't have all the information. It's basically, again, that activation document that allows you to start that project up. You can use this, potentially your project charter, if you're trying to describe what you're trying to do, to maybe you need to bring it to administration to have approval. Maybe you need to bring it to your boss so they can sign off on it. Maybe you need to bring it to the key stakeholders so they can let you know, yes, this is the direction we think it's appropriate to go in, or bring it back, we need some more changes. So the project charter allows you to discuss the project before you put a significant amount of time into planning it. Within the project charter, you're going to want to think about stakeholders. And we talk about stakeholder groups an awful lot. And when you're thinking about and stakeholders are basically just the people that have any level of interest or who may impact the project in some way. So during this phase, it's going to be a good idea to think about who are the stakeholders, what do they want specifically, how is this project going to impact them, what interests do they have, what level of power do they have? So are they able to tank your whole project? Are they the funding agency that can provide more money to make it even larger in the long run? And how they like to be communicated to is also a big one. And when you're thinking about your stakeholder register and how you're going to be communicating with different people, there's a nifty little scatter plot chart that you can make that when you consider the level of power they have versus the level of interest that they have. Those are the two key metrics that I think about when I think about stakeholders, because you may have people who are very, very interested in the outcome of your project, but ultimately they have very little power on either approving it, supporting it, making sure things happen, funding it. So maybe they just they're key people who are interested and it may impact, but they really have no ultimate power to do anything either negative or positive for the project. So down here, they would probably fall low level of power, high level of interest. So you're just keeping them informed. Same with if you have somebody with a significant amount of power, but they aren't that interested, you just keep them satisfied. So you check with what information they want to be communicated to. And then you make sure that they get the information. If you have people that have a high level of power and a high level of interest, maybe this is board members, maybe this is if you're partnering with for a project, a community-wide project, maybe you're working with the school district, maybe the superintendent would fall in here. It all depends on the specifics of the project, and then you would want to manage them closely. So making sure that you give them the information that you want or they want, and you update them on the project regularly. When you think about project management, a lot of the documentation that you'll read is typically about 80 to 90% of a project manager's time is communication. So these are the types of things you're going to want to think about before you get to the planning and executing, is how are we going to communicate with all these people to make sure that they're as informed as possible. And also this is really helpful because if there's interested parties that aren't even considered stakeholders, and maybe they're trying to manage a project that is inappropriate for them to try to manage, you can use this interest scale to kind of help get them out of that that communication process as well. So you can use this to your advantage as a tool, but just thinking through who your stakeholders are, what they want, and moving forward on that one is a good, this is a nice little way to chart them out. You don't have to show them this chart ultimately, it's just for your own reference on how you're going to communicate with people. Next step in the project requirement or the project's charter is going to be the requirements. So what is it that you need to achieve in order to check this project off your list? So these are those tasks, the specific action items that you need to know about to make sure that you can move forward with the project. You can, this is a similar chart you can use too when you're thinking about project requirements, because we've all fallen into the situation where we have this brilliant project idea. So we write up a few paragraphs on it, we deliver it to a funding agency or a board or somebody, and they say, that's great, why don't we include this, or why don't we add this, or why don't we scale back on this? And they have different changes and things like that. Before you actually get to the planning process, you can think about how hard something's going to be versus how important it's going to be, and then they can fall in one or two categories. So if you're presenting to a stakeholder and they say, you know what, we should really add a water slide to this project. And you can think about it as like adding a water slide to our library would be pretty difficult, and it's not really that important to our mission or the scope of this project. So that would fall up on the no-go area. So it's pretty easy to map these out on how hard they are versus how important they are. Just because they're a high-ranking stakeholder doesn't necessarily mean that everything they say goes. You can look at it as this is outside the scope of this project, maybe including a water slide at the library is something that a future project could look at, but it's not something that we can necessarily do right now because it's not important to the project and the level of difficulty is too hard for us to actually incorporate into it. So think about these types of tools as negotiating and having the ability to speak with stakeholders about what you're able to do within the project. You're going to see these document sheets as we move through this presentation. This is the project charter. Essentially, it's a description of the project. It summarizes everything. We'll get to schedule in a minute. Maybe you need to make a business case on why this project is important to your mission, your values, your vision statement of the library. And it also assigns the project manager. This is a step that you're going to want to make sure happens. What I've seen happen in the past is that a library or an organization will have this great project idea and they're trying to manage it through committee. Committees cannot manage projects. You need to have a specific individual who is the checkpoint for making sure that this project is successful in the long run. So when that project manager is assigned, it should be formally accepted within this project charter to give that person the authority to move through this project to make sure that it actually happens. And that was just in the initiation phase. So we haven't even gotten to planning yet. Are there any questions that anyone had that they wanted to throw out about project charter or initiating a project? Everybody looks like they're feeling cozy so far. Okay. So now we've initiated our project. We put the key in the ignition. We've turned it. We have our project charter. We know who our project manager is going to be. Now we need to start getting into the nitty-gritty of how do we take this project and actually plan it out into something that can actually be accomplished. And the first step of that is going to be talking through your project scope. So we talked about your project charter that had some specific information in it. The project scope is one of those triple constraints, your scope, your schedule, and your budget, that you're going to want to put a lot of consideration into. And what a scope essentially is, it's a list of the specific goals that you're trying to achieve. These are the deliverables, the features, the functions, any task, any specific deadline. So maybe you have this project and it has to be done. And ultimately, how much is it going to cost? So this is all the things that you need as a project manager in order to achieve the project. Now, once you have a project scope in place, that project scope cannot change easily. There's a way that you can change it that we'll talk about a little bit later. But when you set your project scope, That's what it is. This is ultimately going to be the project, because without that set scope, then we don't actually know if we've achieved our end deliverables once we get to the end. So we'll talk about changing this, but essentially your project scope is something that's almost set in stone unless there's something that can very formally change it. Project scope's kind of like a checklist. So at the end of the day, with your project scope, once you're able to check everything off your scope, you're able to say, we've completed this project. Congratulations to us. So this is the project purpose, goals, acceptance criteria, deliverables, exclusions, constraints, and assumptions. So these are all different things that you can have in your scope. So the purpose is why you're doing it. Goals is that checklist. Acceptance criteria is how you know that it's going to be done. Deliverables are if you're creating something. Exclusions, you can include in your project scope a list of things you're not going to do. So maybe earlier on when we were negotiating about the level of difficulty and the level of importance, if something came up that is going to be highly difficult and it's not really that important, you can actually add it to this list to say we're definitely not doing this. So later on in conversation, somebody doesn't keep kind of bringing up that topic saying, oh yeah, but remember that first meeting we talked about this? It's fine to include exclusions, things you're not going to do within your project scope, anything to help better define what it is that you're trying to achieve. Constraints could be things that may have a negative impact. Maybe you have staff constraints, maybe you have scheduling constraints, maybe you have money constraints, anything that you might be a little concerned about. And then things you assume. You assume that you can break ground on this new project in the spring of 2023, okay? So these are the things that you assume you're gonna be able to do, but you don't necessarily have direct control over. Project scope. Once you have your project scope created, another thing that helps out quite a bit is having a work breakdown structure. And basically what a work breakdown structure is when you take this project and you break it up into little manageable pieces, because nothing's worse than having a project that's sitting on your to-do list and you can't really check it off because there's so many different pieces that go along with it that you need to accomplish before you actually can check that whole project off your list. So what a work breakdown structure does is it actually cuts it up into a bunch of different pieces. One example I like to give for this one is if you've ever read the book Eat That Frog by Brian Tracy, he says that you should tackle your most difficult tasks right in the early on in the day, because the rest of the day is just easy. But what do you do when you have a big, nasty, ugly thing that you need to accomplish? You cut it up into smaller pieces so we're able to eat that frog in a much easier time frame to be able to take care of it. So at the top, you can see that this is our whole project and each deliverable that we have, and we kind of map out from a top down to figure out exactly what are all the components that we need to do before we're able to check all this stuff off of our scope. Breaking this stuff up and assigning these tasks to different people is essentially what the project manager's work is to make sure that things get done. I wouldn't say to a library director, go and get an increased 259 referendum. That's not a task, that's a project. There's lots of pieces that go into it. What goes into it? Well, they're probably going to have to contact the school district, and they're probably going to have to make sure that they set an appropriate budget, and they're probably going to have to look at what's the timeline for legal postings that they need, what's the end date for when the vote's actually going to happen. There's lots of different pieces that fall within that project. A work breakdown structure just makes it easier to visualize all those little pieces. One thing that you want to avoid when you're talking about work breakdown structures, particularly when you're going through it, and also your scope, is you need to avoid any type of scope creep. And essentially what scope creep is a term that that means you're adding things throughout your project to your scope, so your project is kind of ballooning out of control. And we see this happen all the time, so much so that there's a term associated with it. And what you need to protect against is, and the reason that I had mentioned earlier that your scope is actually something that's almost set in stone, because you don't want to have stakeholders, project managers or other people that are involved in this project to constantly come back with new ideas or things that you could potentially add to the project. And before you know it, your project is breaking its budget, it's breaking its schedule constraints, it's more work than you're going to be able to do. You're not going to be able to finish it within the timeline. So when you create that scope, that's what it is. If you would like to change something in that scope, there should be a formal process of creating change orders to allow that to happen. So it's not to say that you can't change your scope. It's just to say be very careful when doing so, because you have to consider all of your constraints that go along with it. When you're thinking about scope, one of the pieces that you're going to have to get into is you're going to have to start talking money at some point. So how much is this project actually going to cost? This, I find, people have a harder time with because they're not exactly sure how to estimate these types of things. It gets down to essentially budgeting. And there's two tools that you can use to estimate costs. It's basically analogous versus parametric. And when we're thinking about analogous versus parametric, an analogous estimate is basically, we've seen a project similar to this and it costs X amount of dollars, so that's what our budget estimate's going to be. Or you can do it with your budget of your organization. Our budget of our organization was this last year. We're going to use it this year. We're just going to add a few things. Parametric is when you are looking at a size. It's more of a formula. The easiest way to look at it is, so architects, they may have like a square footage estimate for a project. So they come in, they say, here's your whole project, this is how much it's going to cost, and it's based on a square footage of your building. So that's not exactly a real cost estimate. It's just a broad scope one. So you probably want to avoid those unless you're in the early phases of negotiating a project cost. And that's one of the reasons that the Division of Library Development doesn't accept architect quotes for the construction aid program, is because most architects are based off of a square footage assignment. And that's not a bad thing. It's just for that specific program, they need more real costs associated with it rather than generic, larger scale, broad pieces of it. Typically, when you are estimating costs, you can use this will look familiar, you can use your work breakdown structure. You start at the bottom and you estimate how much each item is going to cost until you get to the top and the total for the full amount of the budget. So that usually helps out pretty well. Another tool that you can use is called PERT analysis. We won't get into the nitty-gritty of that. But if you're unsure on how much something's going to cost, you can maybe take a look at a historical project and say, okay, this one cost this amount of money, so we're hoping that it costs this amount. It will most likely cost maybe a little bit more than that, but there's a chance that it may cost significantly more than that. So you add those three numbers together, you divide by 3, and then you get yourself a PERT estimate on your budget amount for that program or that project, which can be helpful. There's other types of PERT analysis. We won't get into those today, though. Another thing to avoid when thinking about projects, specifically with project cost, is this project management term called gold plating. And essentially what this is when you're coming in under budget on things and you say, okay, well, we got a few $100s left, so why don't we go ahead and improve this specific feature that we have on this project? We'll spend a little extra money. The reason that this is put in there is because it's technically a change order that isn't being approved. You're just spending more money in a certain area, whereas perhaps later on in the project, you would need that money somewhere else. So whatever the scope is, as long as you are achieving your deliverables, don't spend more money on something that you don't necessarily have to. If it goes through a change order and they say, okay, that's fine. If you spend that additional money, that's okay. But don't spend more money on stuff if you scoped it out at a certain price. project budget. So you have your financial costs, your time costs, your procurement procedure. So we're libraries. All of us have to follow a procurement procedure depending on how much whatever costs. So make sure you're following that closely. That can actually be something that you attach right to your project budget. So everybody on your project team knows what to do about what. Your exclusions, again, you can list out your same exclusions to make sure that they're not included in your budget. And then your budget change procedure. So if you have things that actually do need to change, maybe something comes back after you go through your procurement process, it comes back at a much higher cost. So how do you change that to either accept the change or reject the change? There should be some procedure for that, whether it's taking it to maybe a board, maybe the project manager has approval of it, and it's noted, and you have a way to approve that type of change. So that's going to be all the documentation stuff that you want in your project budget. The nice thing is that this all applies to scheduling too. So all these tools that we talked about, so the bottom-up estimating instead of dollar figures, same with analogous parametric, instead of dollar figures, you use this for time. You can use this for time. So we think that it's going to take us a month. It most likely will take us 2 months. And the pessimistic side of things is it's going to take 6 months. So you add 1, 2, and 6 together, divide by 3. That's going to be our scheduling estimate for how much time it'll take. It doesn't have to be months, could be a smaller project, could be hours, could be days, could be years, depending on the size of it. So all of your budgeting estimates apply to scheduling as well. And in your project schedule, again, these don't have to be broad, involved types of documents. These can simply be like a paragraph that just says, here's the activity, here's what our team constraints are, here's maybe we're working with vendors, maybe they can only, they can only break ground for these certain months out of the year. What are we dependent on? And then what's the sequence of events? So these are all important things to consider when you're thinking about your project schedule. These are just a couple of scheduling terms. I'm not going to worry about those too much today. And the only thing that I want to say about quality is you want to make sure that quality, and when you're working with project managers, there's a difference between how we use the word quality and how they use the word quality. So quality control essentially means that whatever has been created meets all of the things that we put in our scope. So if something is of good quality, it just means that it checks all the boxes. It doesn't matter how much it costs, doesn't matter if it's gold plated, doesn't matter if it's whatever, it's just that it meets the project goals, and that's essentially what it means. When a project manager talks about grade, that's typically how we use the word quality in everyday life. So a better grade of something means it's usually a better material. So instead of like pressed particle board, maybe you're using like an oak wood. So pressed particle board is a lower grade than oak wood. Both can check the box of quality because they're doing a specific thing. But when you're thinking about grade, it's the different, how good the product is, essentially it is. Usually when you're talking about gold plating, what I said earlier, it's increasing the grade of something, not necessarily the quality of something. And quality is all about conforming to requirements. So here are the requirements that we laid out. This is what we want to make sure it happens. And for quality management, you want to have on there, what are the specific requirements that we need to make sure that all the stuff we created checks all the boxes. We want to say, how does customer satisfaction add to this? And then fitness for use. So making sure that when we're doing quality management, that it's actually fit for our final process. Quality management, this is just during the planning phase. So quality management is just, how are we going to know when this is ready for prime time, when it's ready to go out and actually be implemented and put into place. Usually I do this little exercise where we talk about quality versus grade, but I feel like we covered that. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over that for now. Also in the planning, is having a specific communication plan. Like I said earlier, a significant amount of a project manager's time goes into communication. When you're thinking about your communication, it's usually a good idea to sit down and write down who you're communicating with, how often they need communication, and what they need to know. You can go back to your stakeholder registry that we talked about at the top to help fill this in, but you may have individuals who aren't considered stakeholders that you still need to communicate with. For example, you need to communicate with your project team. Maybe your staff are indirect stakeholders, but you still need to have some communication plan with them. I hear all the time about certain construction projects that'll happen and staff will always feel out of the loop on it. It will behoove you to take a little bit of time to say who is potentially going to be impacted, how are we going to communicate with them, what do they need to know, the frequency of that, and automate as much as that communication as possible. That's not to say that you're opening it up for criticism or commentary on the communication. This is just a way to keep everybody on the same page throughout the life cycle of the project. And this is just figuring out how we're going to do it. We're still in the planning phase. We're not actually doing this stuff yet. We're just talking about how we're going to do it. Every project that you work on is going to come with some form of risk. And this risk could be significant risk, like maybe you are working on a construction project and there's a risk that if we put it off another year, prices of steel are going to skyrocket, and the risk is that we're not going to be able to afford the project. To something low stakes, so maybe a risk if you're developing a program plan is people won't show up to our programs. That's always a risk too. Risk management is just thinking through what are these potential risks in the context of our project and how might we handle them if they come up. There's usually 5 different ways that you can deal with any type of risk. You can either accept it and you say, yep, this is going to happen, or it may happen, and when it does, we're just going to deal with it. You can avoid it. So maybe you do everything you can to make sure that if you have a very specific risk in mind that is able to be avoided, you try it. You can transfer risk. Typically, this is usually through purchasing insurance. Like when you get in your car and you drive down the road, there's an inherent piece of risk that goes along with that. We transfer it by purchasing insurance to cover us if that risk actually comes to fruition. We can mitigate it by doing everything we can to lessen that risk, even though we know it's going to happen, or we can exploit it. Risk isn't a bad term, it's just a term. There could be positive risks too. So when you think about all the risks that happen, they could be things that may work out to your benefit. For example, let's say one of our risks is maybe nobody shows up, but on the other hand, maybe too many people show up, which that may be a good thing for you. It may be a troublesome thing for you as well. But thinking about how can we use this to our advantage is another way to handle that type of risk. But when you're working with planning a project, think about what risks may pop up so you're better equipped to handle them when they actually do. Some people get really hung up on risk management and thinking about, oh, this could happen, whatever. People play devil's advocate saying, well, we could move forward with this, but this part of it may go wrong. Don't get too hung up on it. Again, this is just a few sentences. Here's a couple things that may pop up, and if they do, here's how we're going to handle it. We're not talking about catastrophic things, just things within the realm of possibility. It's within the realm of possibility that your construction project may be postponed to the point where you have to take it up next year. The price of steel may be higher. That is a realistic risk. But the risk of an earthquake coming and breaking down the foundation of your library before you start your project probably isn't going to happen in our area. That may be a real risk somewhere else, but not necessarily here. So they're realistic risks are what you're thinking about. Project management plan. So we went over a lot of these different things. So your project charter, that was your description, your summary, your PM, your scope, your budget, your schedule, what you need to have for quality, your communication plan, and your risk management plan. All of these together equal your project management plan. So all these things that we thought about, we write them down, and we have a couple pieces of paper that now have a well thought out planned project. So we stuck the key in the ignition, we turned it for our charter. Now it's activated. Now we're ready to start rolling with actually executing the project. So this first 45 minutes that we talked now was just all about how do you get to this point where you're ready to launch the project. It may seem like a lot if you go through like a significant design process of like a waterfall technique or something for project management. All of this stuff can seem very cumbersome, but if you take a little bit of time ahead of time and you write through and think through these different aspects, it's going to make the rest of your job a lot easier when you're actually trying to implement the project, because the next phase that we're going to get into is actually executing. So this is when we have our plan, we know what we're doing, we're ready to start working on that project to make sure that it gets done. This is where we do the work, we manage the project, we support the team, and we respond to any risks that pop up. Supporting the team, this is a big piece of it. Your project manager is in charge of whatever project it is that you're doing, but you'll most likely have a team that's working with you. This could be one other person, this could be 50 other people. Depending on the size and scope of your project, you may need other people. And a project manager's job, again, is about the communication between all the members of the team, all the stakeholders, and everyone we identified earlier. So you want to make sure that that support is there appropriately. Typically, when you have some type of team, if it's a new project team, you go through different stages before you actually start performing well. I like to think about this as in the context of the project management process as well. Forming is basically when a team comes together and they start working on things, they start figuring each other out. This is kind of the part that this I equate to like a project charter piece. Storming is when you're thinking about all of the different aspects of how things are working, how things are not working. You normalize and you're able to start doing work. Performing is when you do the work exceptionally well and you're getting things done. And then adjourning is just when it's over and you close out, you release your team members and you say everything's done. So thinking about some team dynamic stuff is a good idea when you're thinking about how the project manager is actually going to interact with getting the work done. One thing I always like to mention, if you are going to be working on a project, only invite people who are appropriate to work on that project. You may have people who want to be involved in every single thing that the library is doing. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are appropriate to be on the project team. You want to make sure that you're inviting the people that are going to bring something to the ultimate project. They're going to be able to do work. They're going to be able to do something that's going to further the progress. You don't want somebody that's just kind of sitting in the sidelines, or worse, causing issues or roadblocks for the team. I'm going to skip over conflict among team members right now because it's going to happen, and it's something that you're going to have to deal with. It's typically usually specific to the types of conflict. I do a whole nother presentation on conflict management and resolution, but just realize that just because you set up these perfect project charter scope and all your plans, you have this project management plan that's going to carry out really well, doesn't necessarily mean that your project team will not have any conflict that goes along with it. So this is a real thing. It's something that you'll have to work with at some point, but it's just something to keep in mind. As you're executing doing the work, you're working on making sure that you are putting all the quality measures into place, you're doing the actual work that needs to be done, you're going to go through this cycle called monitoring and controlling. And essentially what this means is that as you're doing project work, you want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on things that they're effective and everything's getting done, and then you control it to make sure that everything's right. So it's kind of like just this, once you set things up and people are doing the work, you just keep an eye on things. That's essentially what monitoring and controlling phase is. And this is also where change control comes in. And I've mentioned this a couple times. if you have a project, you need to have a formal process for how changes are going to happen. What you don't want to have happen, especially if you're the project manager, is to have one person on your team say, oh, I think it would be better to do this way. And then all of a sudden go off in a completely different direction because it's going to derail your entire process. Maybe you're working on a project plan for your programs throughout the year, your community-based programs that you're going to do, and the main focus is on maybe teen services. So you're coming up with all these teen services programs, and then all of a sudden somebody has this idea on your team that, oh, we should do family services instead, and then adult services. And if they don't put that through change control, they may start working on a different avenue of producing programs that's really going to mess up the ultimate scope of what your project is. Another important reason for change control is if you have somebody who maybe is going through your procurement procedures to get costs and things, and a cost comes back significantly higher, and they agree to that without going through change control, that could mean that your project is going to run out of money because maybe they spent too much money and it wasn't appropriately accounted for through change control. So basically what this is a procedure for when something comes up that's outside of the project scope. Who am I going to talk to? How does it need to be approved? And how do we communicate back to the person who initially put it there? Change control comes in. You don't have to make a change. Basically, it's just a way to make sure that you are keeping an eye on everything within the project to make sure that you don't have any surprises. Yep, integrated change control. So any change to the scope that could potentially impact your project, it needs to go through integrated change control. And usually this is, how do we handle a change? Who makes the final decision? Is it the project manager? Is it the board? Is it a stakeholder group? Is it the customer? So you may not know who the final person is or the final group is that needs to make the yes or no decision on that, but you should have that as a plan so you know who it's going to be and who can submit change requests. So maybe if the group that needs to accept changes is your full board, only the director can submit change requests. So it has to go through, and maybe the director is the project manager. So maybe if a staff issue comes up, it goes through the director to the board, and that's the final approval, yay or nay, for whatever the project is. It doesn't have to be staff to board. It can be any type of iteration. Maybe you have a project team and the project manager has the final one, but you have a team leader. So there's lots of ways to think about this, but it's best to think about, if something comes up that we need to change, how are we going to handle this to make sure it doesn't go out of control? Validating scope is essentially just making sure that you get the work done that you promised that you're going to get done. You're going to shift between doing work and monitoring and controlling, and that's okay. You're going to do some work and maybe check the scope and you're like, this isn't quite exactly what we had promised. So then we go back to executing and we do the work again, and then back to monitoring and controlling to make sure that everything's okay. And then we go back to doing the work. So this is the only process area where you may flop back and forth between what you're doing and then making sure that you're controlling everything that you're doing. And that's fine. It doesn't necessarily just happen once, could happen a handful of times. Basically, it goes back until you're able to say everything within our scope is validated, which means we have checked everything off the list and we're all done. And the final process area is actually closing things out. This is probably the biggest mistake that I see people make when they're looking at projects. They plan it out, they know exactly what's going to happen, they start doing the work, they get things done, and then for whatever reason, they don't formally close it. So then the project just kind of keeps going, and you have these people that are kind of lightly or loosely working on the project until it fades away. Remember, the definition of a project was creating something unique with a specific start and end to it. You have to close out projects in order to release your team so they can start working on whatever the next project is. This goes back to, I was talking about using library programs as a model for projects. So you start your planning on what you're actually going to be doing throughout the year, and then you have a close date on when it's over. If you don't close it out, you're just constantly going to be in this exhaustive cycle of planning and executing and things like that. But you should have a formal closeout for what you're going to do. And that's why I say do not forget to close out your projects. You can have a closing checklist. You can validate your scope, make sure that you have all the deliverables that you need. Figure out what you learned from it. This is another area that people skip out on a lot. When you have any type of project, you're probably going to learn a lot from it. So track all of those changes, kind of figure out what it is did we learn from this project that we can apply to one in the future. This is sometimes called a postmortem. So after your project, you can pick apart everything that went wrong. So you can use that as documentation that you have internally. So next time you run a similar project, you can take a look at here are all the things that went wrong so we can avoid all this stuff. And then you formally release your team. You say, okay, we're all done. Everybody's done. And then it's always a good idea to have a little party after it too. And you've made it to the end. So your project management plan, again, is your charter, your scope, your budget, your schedule, your management, your quality management, your communication plan, your risk management plan, integrated change control. We added that one. That's how changes happen. Your closing checklist, and all of those things together have is now your completed project management plan. If you have all those in a single document and you file that away after you close it out, that's going to be an incredible resource as you plan additional projects in the future that you want to be able to make sure that you're able to accomplish. So project management is a mixture of having an appropriate amount of documentation, making sure that you're planning everything so you can get it done, and then creating a list of resources that you can use for other types of projects. And the beautiful thing about this is that you can work with other organizations and share your similar successful projects and exactly what was the process that you went through that made it successful, or what was the process that you went through where it failed. A failed project doesn't mean that something was wrong. It doesn't always mean something was wrong with the project manager or the team or something like that. Maybe throughout the project, there was a significant number of risks that popped up that really derailed the project, and it was unforeseen stuff that just destroyed the project plan. Seeing that after the fact can be really helpful for planning those future projects. So there's a lot of stuff that can be gained from documenting everything. And it doesn't have to be cumbersome, but making sure that you have a record of exactly what happened so you can move forward with your projects as you move forward. So that was a really quick overview on project management in general. I would love to take any questions that anyone has, any projects that you're currently working on, or any other issues that you've run into when kind of creating your own projects or carrying them out. And I'd love to chat about those. Anyone have any questions or things that have popped up? And Jen, if there's anything in chat, I'd be happy to address those too.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Claudia.
Hey, so I guess it's a kind of multi-pronged question, but first, is there any particular software that you use to sort of, you creating this in a Word document? Are you using, so that's my first question.
Yeah, so the answer to your first question is people love some project management software. There's so many different tools that are out there. And people will argue about what the best software is. I just open up a Google Doc because I think it's easy to be able to type everything in there and then share it with the project team. Or, you can use online Microsoft Office, something like that. There's like Monday.com, there's Asana, there's Trello. You can use it in Evernote. There's so many different project management softwares out there that it can be exhausting to evaluate all of them. What I would say is whatever is most comfortable for your project team, go with that one. And then it doesn't really matter what software you use in the end, because you can always export all that information out to create an archive of it. But I would say a lot of software has these incredible bells and whistles and stuff like that. 90% of them you're probably not going to use. I just use a Word doc, but I know some people are really savvy. Some people really like to use, they create Gantt waterfall charts in Excel, and that works really well for them, and that's great. I just use Word docs because I find it easy. You just heading it. Here's my charter, here's my scope, here's my budget, that kind of stuff. And I keep it all in one document.
Mhm. And then I guess, thank you. And then my other question is just kind of, when you're putting together those component parts, you've got your overhead, how granular do you go? One of my staff members is on this, Lori, and we did a couple of really big projects last year. We totally redid our website, and we did our marketing, and we strategic plan and whatever. But it's just like you could spend all of your time sort of managing the deliverables. Like, how granular do we need to go? How do we, and putting names next to things. I guess I'm just sort of wondering, like, when is it too much? How do you know how deep to go? That kind of thing.
And that's one of a good question. And that's one of the reasons that going through the different processes is important. So when you're going through the initiation process and you're putting all this information together, once you are done with that process, you're not going to go back to it unless you have a really good reason to do it. And I would say, depending on the size of the project, in most cases, you're not going to need to get too granular on the information. Like, let's say you're doing a website redesign, and part of that process is, you need to decide what's going to be your content management system, what type of content are you going to want on there, what do you not want on there, and I would say have like loose ideas of what all those things are going to be, and then once you get to the actual executing phase, as things come up, you just make note of them and you say, okay, this is the direction we're going, this is the direction we're going, whatever it is, and you keep track of it. So project management for coming up with a plan it has important aspects of making sure that you're thinking through everything, but you don't want to get stuck in the cycle of only thinking through stuff and not actually getting to the execution phase. So I would say a good rule of thumb is, if you're getting to the point where you feel like you're planning too much and you're not executing enough, then you're probably done planning and it's time to move into the next phase. But that's a good question. I know that a lot of people can get stuck in kind of the paralysis of, we have to keep planning or we have to think about every single eventuality. And like risk management, again, when I mentioned that a lot of people get stuck on risk management because they love thinking about, what are all the horrible things that can go wrong? Set a time limit for 10 minutes. We're going to think about all the risks that could pop up and roughly what we would do about them. And then you're done. That was risk management. And you're not going to revisit it unless you think of something that is a realistic risk that we're actually worried about. And typically those are going to be things that you've already experienced before. Like maybe if you're coming up with a program plan, like, what do we do when nobody shows up and we have a presenter standing here staring at us, expecting something of us? What do you do in that situation? So that's something that I would plan on. I wouldn't worry about, what if the power goes out and we're not able to, do whatever. So just don't get too granular, I guess. And it's one of those things where it's probably, it as you work through it, and as you practice at it, but don't let your team go down those rabbit holes either, because it can be pretty time consuming. Both good questions though. Thanks, Claudia.
Thanks.
What else do we have out there? What other questions or situations have we run into when planning projects that we want to talk about?
So I really like the part about only inviting appropriate team members. What if in the middle of the process you discover that one person is really not appropriate for the team? How do you approach that?
So I would look at it as, how did you discover that it was inappropriate, and kind of base your decision off of that. So was it an inappropriate match because maybe they had a high level of interest in it and they had the skill sets to help out, but then when they started working on it, you realize that their schedule is just too full and they don't have time to dedicate to the project. In that case, it's easy. It's just a direct conversation that is, we recognize that your schedule is too busy, we can look at it as you can either drop these other things or you'll have to drop this project, one or the other. If they were assigned to the project and you realize that they're not working out because maybe there's some internal conflict with another team member, that's a little bit different. That's when I would fall back on conflict resolution, and I would have a conversation with them to say, to talk to them about what we're trying to achieve and what are the roadblocks that are coming up behind it. And then if it turns out that maybe this person has such a significant conflict with this other team member, then you may have to dismiss them from the team. And that's okay. It's not like you're firing them. You're just saying that for this specific project, we're going to remove you from the project team because of this instance, and you document it. And it's an internal document. If they're your staff, I'd probably put it in their personnel file because you're going to want to know when things don't work out. And if it was maybe a scheduling thing, I would put that under lessons learned too. At the end of your project, when you're closing out, one of the big things is maybe we didn't properly look at the amount of time that it was going to take, or we didn't look at other people's workloads before we assign them to this project. What other types of issues do you think you may run into with seeing that halfway through a project, it may be an inappropriate staff person? Lori, do you have any other examples that you want me to go through?
Just that I think sometimes you'll have someone involved in a project who doesn't stick to the scope, and they start to gold plate everything, and then it infects the whole team. And then I've seen that happen.
With that one, I just always fall back on the scope and say, this is what everybody agreed to. This is what we're moving forward with. We cannot go through any other iterations unless it goes through the appropriate change control. And then maybe that staff member then gives it to you, maybe gives it to Claudia, and then you decide on whether or not it's something that you can put in the scope. So you can still give them a platform to give their ideas, and then you approve them or don't approve them, but they should respect from the start to the finish what that scope actually is. And if they can't stick to that, then you treat it as you would anything else. Maybe 3 strikes, you're out. Like, you try to do these things, you're upsetting the balance that we're trying to create with this, or they don't have the authority to make certain decisions, so you remove them from the project team because of that. If I was told, Ron, you are spending too much money on this specific thing, or you're issuing too many change requests for this project where it's getting away from the scope, we have to remove you from the project team, that would be pretty humiliating for me. I would think that that would be a pretty significant blow to the staff person. So what you want to do is just make sure you have that conversation about how their activities are challenging the scope of what you're trying to create before you remove them from the team. But ultimately, you may have to get to that point too. And again, just document all that stuff too. And it doesn't have to be like project documentation, that may be personnel documentation that you keep on file.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but that's a big one. And as you run into those types of conflict things with team members, it's the project manager's responsibility to handle them, but it doesn't mean that they're the ones that are carrying out the final whatever. Maybe it's a conversation with, with a project sponsor, a supervisor, whoever that ultimately needs to do the work of it. But your job is to make sure that this project continues on and you don't allow people to upset the scope unless they have ideas where you actually do want to change a scope, in which case you just go through change control to make sure that happens appropriately.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question, Lori. What else do we have?
I just want to say one other thing. I really like the availability of putting in exclusions into the scope. That seems great. Like, we are not talking about this.
Yep. I think I've seen so many meetings be derailed repeatedly because of specific ideas, especially when it comes from a stakeholder. And if you've had the conversation and you say it's not happening, You put it on that list as this is not happening. And I think that's totally appropriate. You are 100% allowed to put exclusions on there, mainly because just like Lori was saying earlier with like, gold plating stuff, if a team member didn't see that or wasn't involved with that, and then maybe let's say a board member kept bringing something up that they wanted included in this project, and the rest of the board and you are like, look, we can't afford that, it's not going to happen. If it wasn't on an exclusion list, maybe this board member inappropriately went to a staff member and said, hey, you should add this to the project, and they start working on that, then that could screw up a lot of things because they didn't know it was an exclusion. So I use that as a tool to explain to people that I use it as a tool to better explain the scope of what we're trying to do. So I say that's totally appropriate. Do it. Again, that doesn't have to be a long list. Like, you don't have to include everything, but if you have a tangential thing that's related to it and you know that you're not going to do it, but you know it might come up as a problem, put it on the exclusions list. And I think that's a good tool to use. What else we got? Yeah, Charlotte, go ahead.
Hi, I'm actually Margaret from the Charlotte Library. It
Oh,
confuses
okay. I'm
everybody.
sorry.
I should have changed my name, but anyway, no. So I had to step away for a minute, so someone may have already asked about this, but I'm wondering about, this sounds like such a useful way to think about projects, and I'm wondering about the size of the project that would seem appropriate. I mean, because I could see that I would want to start doing this for everything, and in a way that could become a bit inefficient. If every little project that comes down the pike, I'm like, oh, stop, we've got to do this project management.
I say do it for everything unless it's a task. Okay. Like if it's a task and it takes just a few minutes to do it, obviously you don't need to do this. But if you have, let's say you have a small scale project, and in order to deliver the project, there's maybe 10 or 11 tasks that go along with it. Instead of spending any amount of time on like risk, maybe you skip that piece. You don't have to go through every part of it. Maybe all you do is you write a project charter that says, this is what we're going to do. This is who's going to do it. And here's our checklist to make sure it's done. And that's it. And maybe it's like a half a piece of paper with it, but as long as you're thinking through this stuff. So quick projects, this works out fine with. If it's something where it's just a handful of tasks that you just need to do, just go ahead and do it. That's fine. That can just go through your normal productivity system. But if it's a specific project, regardless of size, it just means you spend a different amount of time on these things. Maybe you don't worry so much about the budget because it's already in there, so you don't have to put a dollar amount to it. Or maybe it's just you doing the project, so you don't have to worry so much about the schedule. You just have your deadline and then you work on it from there. Typically, this is going to work better for like, not necessarily like tiny projects, but like, once you get to smaller to medium to large scale things, this is going to work out pretty well. But just think, if it's a small cluster of tasks, you can just do that. But if it starts to get something where you're going to have to communicate regularly with people, it makes sense to sit down and just like write down your thoughts for, say for the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to go through each one of these processes and write out just a sentence about each one. That's going to help clarify what you want to do in the future. And then that way, even if it is a small scale project, if a supervisor, a board, a boss comes and says like, what is this all about? You can just hand them, this piece of paper that you took a bit of time to make sure that you wrote it out. And then at the end, write everything that went well, write what didn't go well. If sitting down and taking 15 minutes seemed like too much time, say that and write it out. Taking 15 minutes to plan this out was too much. Next time, let's try 5 to 10 minutes or something like that. The thing is, apply this as much as possible and then figure out where it's most appropriate and where it doesn't really work out well for you, and then capture those lessons learned. Because project management isn't about just completing something. It's about how can we take this model, help us this, and we learn something and we help us this. It's kind of it's an ongoing constant learning. And that's how organizations start what's called a project management office, which is essentially a department of an organization that monitors all the projects and has their templates. They have this very specific way of doing things. And it also captures all those things that we learned through it. So essentially, you are your own project management office. How can we apply these most effectively? So I would say start with everything and then figure out, it doesn't really work for this. And that's okay.
Okay.
Similar projects, you just don't apply it to.
Okay, it sounds like it would also be very helpful. You referenced this a couple times in sort of documentation if there are ever any questions after something happens. So even as a library as small as mine, I could see that that would be very helpful. So thanks so
Yeah,
much. This is great.
One of the big things that I've noticed, because we've had in my system, we've had I don't know about your system, so we've had a ton of director turnover. And when a new director starts, there's nothing exists. Nothing exists about like even just operational stuff, let alone the projects that they've been working on. So project management, you can also think of it as a really beneficial way to succession plan too. So document everything to make the next person's life easier and hope that whoever you will eventually replace had done the same thing for you. So it's kind of this community-based thing as well. Like, let's just get a little better at making, and it doesn't have to be significant documentation. It can just be a couple lines, but thinking through this stuff is going to help projects ultimately in the long run.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions that people have before we break? Those are solid questions. I appreciate all those coming up. Anything else? Okay. Jen, I'm good if you're good.
I'm good. Thank you very much, Ron. Again, I learned an awful lot, got myself back in perspective, and I'm excited to start using some of the tools of project management on some of my projects that I have coming up. Thank you very much. And again, just a reminder, Ron will share the slides. This was recorded and will be available soon on the Sustainable Libraries Initiative website. And thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.